In those days, the sky over Israel seemed heavy. It was as if even God had fallen silent for a time. The people lived oppressed by a foreign king, Antiochus Epiphanes, who arrived with promises of progress but brought destruction. He didn't just want to control the territory, he wanted to erase the identity of an entire people. It started with small prohibitions. They could no longer keep the Sabbath or circumcise their children. Then came the desecrations. The temple in Jerusalem, a sacred place, became the scene of pagan rituals. An altar to Zeus was erected right in the heart of what was once holy. In the streets, there was fear, but there was also a mixture of anger and sadness. Many Jews, afraid of dying or losing what little they had, began to surrender. Others remained silent. And the most dangerous were those who tried to justify everything, saying that it was better to give up a little than to lose everything. Subscribe to the channel for more exciting Bible stories and turn on notifications so you don't miss any videos. If this content touches your heart and you want to support us, feel free to click on the "Thanks a lot" button. All help is welcome and makes a big difference. It was at this time that a simple but determined man appeared on the scene. He did not live in Jerusalem. He was not a king or a general. He was Mattathias, a priest from the small town of Modim. Nothing about him stood out at first glance. No expensive clothes, no crowds of followers. But he carried something rare, the courage to be faithful, even when it meant facing the most powerful empire of the time. While most bowed their heads, he stood tall. His 5 sons looked at him as one would look at a rock, firm, unshakable. He taught the Torah, yes, but he taught with his life. He spoke little, observed much, and in his heart burned a question that would not leave him in peace. How far can a man give in without losing his soul? That morning, Modim seemed like any other. The sun rose slowly behind the hills. Merchants opened their stalls, and boys ran through the stone alleys. But there was a strange silence in the air. Something in the atmosphere seemed suspended, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Matias woke up early, as he always did. He was not a lazy man. With his eyes still marked by time, he took the scroll of the law and sat down with his sons. It was not just a moment of reading. It was a sacred ritual. He taught them the names of the patriarchs as one who passes on a living heritage. He was no young man. He had already lived through many seasons. He was born into a priestly lineage, the son of John, a descendant of Hasmon. This placed him in a position of respect, but he never used it to aggrandize himself. He was respected for his steadfastness, not for his titles. His calloused hands spoke of hard work, and his hard eyes showed that he had seen more than he would have liked. He raised his children with the same strictness that shaped his faith. John was the eldest and responsible. Simon, the strategist, thought before he acted. Judas, the third, had fire in his eyes. He was the most like his father in temperament. Eleazar was firm and direct, while Jonathan had a sensitive heart but a strong spirit. They were different from each other, but united by the same teaching: you don't negotiate the truth. Matatias wasn't looking for trouble. His desire was to live in peace, honor the law, take care of his family, and keep the people strong in difficult times. But he knew, deep down, that something bigger was coming. It was as if the winds of history were already beginning to blow in his direction. And then, on that same day, the sound of horses cut through the air. It was no ordinary traveler. It was the arrival of the empire. Dust rose before they appeared. First, the rhythmic sound of hooves. Then the banners bearing the king's seal. And finally, the soldiers. Shining armor, hard faces, cold eyes. They entered Modim as if stepping on an anthill, certain they would meet no resistance. They were accustomed to forced obedience. With them came a Seleucid officer, elegant, smiling, but with venom in his voice. He gathered the city elders in the square and announced, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, that it was time for everyone to adapt to the new guidelines. In other words, abandon the law of their fathers and make sacrifices to the Greek gods. The crowd fell silent. No one wanted to be the first to say no, but no one wanted to say yes either. That was when the officer pointed to Mattathias, calling him by name. "You are a respected man, priest. If you are the first to obey, the others will follow, and the king will be generous to you and your children." It was like offering a poisoned banquet. For a second, everything stopped. The sound of birds disappeared. The air seemed denser. Mattathias looked around. His sons stared at him intently. The people waited for his decision. The entire city seemed to fit into a single moment, but he did not hesitate. His answer came sharp as a knife. "Even if all the nations obey the king, I and my sons will follow the covenant of our fathers." The silence turned to whispers. The whispers turned to tension. And then a man from the city itself, a Jew, stepped forward. Slowly he walked to the pagan altar. He was going to make the sacrifice. He was going to betray everything he believed in. It was at that moment that Mattathias moved. In a fit of rage and pain, he drew his sword. First, he killed the traitor, then the officer, and the square turned into a storm. Blood was still dripping on the ground when the screams began. Some fled, others stood paralyzed. The remaining soldiers did not expect this. A priest rebelling, sword in hand, in the middle of the square. It was a shock. But Mattathias knew that this gesture could not be undone. He had just lit a fire that no one else could extinguish. There was no time for speeches. He called his sons with a steady gaze. "To the mountains!" That was all he said, and they understood. They ran through alleys, cut through olive groves, climbed the hillsides as if running for their lives. They took what they could, some clothes, supplies, the scrolls of the law. The rest was left behind. In the mountains of Judea, the world was different. Arid, cold at night, silent in a way that made your heart beat fast. But there, far from the king's orders, there was freedom. It was on that hard ground that the resistance began to take shape. First came a few, then dozens. Soon, hundreds, men, women, children, elders. It was not an army, it was a wounded people, but still standing. Mattathias did not become a commander overnight, but the people followed him. His unbreakable faith gave them direction. He spoke little, but every word seemed heavy with meaning. And around the campfires, on dark nights, he gathered the people. He spoke of the ancients, Moses, Elijah, the prophets. He reminded everyone that this fight was not just against soldiers, it was a battle for the soul of Israel. In that hiding place made of stone and wind, discouragement was a constant threat. But Mattathias kept his eyes open. He knew the enemy would come. It was only a matter of time, and when they came, they had to be ready. Then, between patrols, the first attacks began. The news spread like wildfire. The priest of Modim has rebelled. A group is in the mountains. They are attacking the king's soldiers. It was difficult to know what was true and what was exaggeration. But one thing no one could deny. Someone was challenging the empire. And that someone was Mattathias. Old, yes. Tired too, but with a fire in his heart that even the cold of the mountains could not extinguish. He no longer had the strength he once had, but in return, he had something that many did not have, an unshakable faith. During the day, he sent small groups to attack enemy posts, destroy pagan altars, and rescue children who were about to be handed over. At night, he gathered the people and spoke of the law, of God's promises, of the covenant that could not be broken. His voice was calm but firm, like thunder that doesn't need to shout to frighten. More than a leader, Mattathias became a symbol. The people who came to him were not just soldiers. They were ordinary men, marked by loss, tired of bowing down, thirsty for justice. Some barely knew how to hold a sword, but he taught them to fight. First with courage, then with strategy. And with each successful mission, a seed was planted. The people began to believe again. They began to remember who they were. It was as if an ancient memory was awakening, shaking off the dust of years of silence and fear. But there was a weight in Matatias's eyes. He knew that time waited for no one. He felt it in his bones, in his short breaths, in the moments of exhaustion that came without warning. Even so, he continued, because there was still something that needed to be done. And it was on one of those cold nights, looking at the stars as if seeking direction, that he made a decision. The cold that night seemed different. It wasn't just the wind cutting through the mountains, it was the silence that came with it. A strange silence that even the bonfires couldn't break. Matatias was quieter than usual. Sitting on a rock, his body wrapped in a thick cloak, he stared at the fire, but seemed to see something else, perhaps the past, perhaps what was yet to come. He called his sons, one by one, without haste. When they were all there, sitting around him as so many times before, Matatias spoke. His voice was weaker, but still firm. There was no lament, only truth. "My sons, the time has come." Their eyes met in the dark. No one said anything, they knew. His father's body was tired, and his spirit was already elsewhere. But before he left, he needed to leave more than memories. He needed to pass on the mission. He spoke to each of them, reminding them of their qualities. He emphasized that they were all important, that they would all have a role to play in this struggle. But when his eyes rested on Judas, something changed. The air grew heavy. "Judas, you are strong like the hammer that breaks the stone. It is with you that the people will rise up." He was direct. There was no ceremony. He passed the leadership of the revolt to the son who carried fire in his eyes and determination in his hands. Not out of favoritism, but out of destiny. He knew it. Everyone knew it. Then Matatias did something he rarely did. He became emotional. He asked them never to stray from the law, never to be afraid to die for what is eternal. And as he spoke, his sons no longer saw an old priest. They saw the man who had challenged an empire with faith and sword. That same night, Matatias rested, and for the first time, the camp woke up without the voice of their father, but with Judas standing, eyes ablaze, sword steady, ready for what lay ahead. The next morning, the camp seemed different. Mattathias's body had not yet been buried, but his silence weighed more heavily than any stone. The man who had been the center of the resistance for so long now rested, and all eyes turned to Judas. He was not the oldest, nor was he the most diplomatic, but he was the most feared in the enemy ranks and respected among his own. Judas did not need to shout to be heard. The way he walked among the men, his steady gaze that never wavered, his posture of one who had already decided before he even began, was enough. His name earned him a surname among those who fought, Maccabeus. They said it meant hammer, and indeed, when he entered battle it was like a sharp blow against injustice. Fast, direct, brutal when he needed to be. But it wasn't just strength. Judas was also cunning. He learned from every attack, studied the enemy, and used the terrain as an ally. The first victory under his command came quickly. A much larger, better-equipped army was surprised in an ambush. The Greek soldiers, accustomed to enemies who surrendered, were not prepared for men who fought with their hearts. The news spread. The Maccabees had won. After that, others followed. Each battle seemed impossible, but Judas went forward and won. Not by magic, but because he knew the people. He knew their pain, and he knew the God he served. The battlefields became schools. With each confrontation, the people became more united, and with each victory, hope was reborn. But deep down, Judas knew he couldn't stop there, because while the enemy armies were reorganizing, something even more precious continued to be desecrated, and Judas, even amid the cries of war, could think of only one place, the temple in Jerusalem. The road to Jerusalem was not easy. Every step taken by Judas and his men was marked by fatigue, dust, and memories of what they had lost. But there was something stronger than the weight of their sandals, the desire to see the temple restored. It was not just a stone building, it was the heart of their faith, the soul of the people. And it was dirty, taken over, wounded. When they got close to the city, many eyes filled with tears. They could see the walls from afar, but what had once been a source of pride now caused outrage. The altar had been desecrated. Offerings to foreign gods covered the floor where pure incense had once been burned to the Lord. It was like looking at an open wound. Judas did not cry. He did not scream. He just went in. With slow steps, he crossed the rubble, looked at what was left and began to give orders. Everything that was contaminated was torn down. Every stone that was out of place was put back. Torches were lit, instruments were purified, and the people were summoned. It lasted for days, days of hard work, fasting and prayer. But when they were done, the temple shone again. Not like before, perhaps even more so, because now there was sweat, struggle, and blood involved in it all. It was more than a reconstruction, it was a resurrection. They lit the candelabra, the menorah, with the little pure oil they could find. They said it would not last more than a day, but the flame burned for 8. 8 days of light where there had only been darkness. The people celebrated, and there was born the festival that would later be known as Hanukkah. But even with the temple restored, Judas did not let his guard down. He knew that this victory was only a respite, because his enemies, upon learning of the purification, would not remain silent. They were preparing, and what was to come would require even more than faith. The city breathed again. The streets of Jerusalem, which had once carried the smell of strange sacrifices and uncomfortable silence, were now filled with voices, prayers, and life. It was as if the people had returned home after a long exile, even though they had never left. But Judas knew winning a war was not enough. The real victory would be to keep the flame they had rekindled burning. So he did not allow the sword to rest for long. He devised strategies, strengthened alliances, prepared the people. And most importantly, he continued to remind them who they were, where they came from, and why they were fighting. The memory of Mattathias was not forgotten. It was in every decision Judas made, in every lesson passed on to the younger ones, in every glance exchanged between brothers. It was as if their father was still among them, invisible but present. Not like a ghost, but like the firm roots of a tree that was now growing fast in the midst of a storm. Judas's name spread. Outside the borders of Israel, he came to be seen as a threat, inside as a hero, but he never behaved like one. He refused crowns, avoided titles, and stayed focused. What he and his brothers were building was not a kingdom, it was a legacy, something that could be passed on even after the battles were over. The people who had once been afraid to speak now told the story of Mattathias with a sparkle in their eyes. In homes, synagogues, and secret meetings, the elders recounted how it all began, how an old priest had refused to bow his knees, and how, because of that, his sons had risen up. But the world outside was not silent. Other nations, other kings, other armies were approaching, and the name Maccabees echoed like a challenge. Time passed, the battles continued, and enemies came from all sides. Some with swords, others with words, trying to buy with promises what they could not take by force. But the foundation had already been laid, and the name of Mattathias remained a rock in the hearts of the people. He was no longer there. He did not walk among the men. He did not speak at meetings. But it was impossible to look at history without feeling his presence. It was in Judas's eyes when he made difficult decisions, in Simon's way of analyzing routes, in Jonathan's courage when defending the weakest. It was as if the father's soul had been divided among his children. And even without building walls or palaces, Mattathias left behind a dynasty, not of kings with golden crowns, but of men with purpose. His descendants, the Hasmoneans, went on to rule Israel. not as tyrants, but as defenders of the faith. The old priest who once said no to the pagan altar ended up ushering in a new era, and even he could not have imagined the power of that gesture. Even today, when people talk about resistance, courage, and faith, his name comes up. Not with fanfare, but with reverence, like someone who remembers someone who did the right thing when no one else had the courage to do so. And that is precisely why he changed everything. He did not see the final victory. He did not witness the cleansing of the temple, nor did he hear the songs of Hanukkah. But every detail of that story bore the mark of his choice, the choice not to give in. And perhaps that is where the secret lies. Because, in the end, the greatest legacies are not made of what we achieve, but of what we sustain when everything wants us to give up. The story of Mattathias does not end with him. It ends with those who chose to follow the same path, because what he started, with a sword in one hand and faith in the other, continued to echo long after his death. He was not the kind of man who sought glory, but he was exactly the kind who ends up becoming eternal in the memory of those who came after him. The great lesson he left behind is not only in the victories of the Jewish people or the liberation of the temple. It is in the moment when he said no, while everyone else expected a yes. A man in a small town with everything to lose. He could have chosen comfort, security, the easy way out, but no, he stood his ground, and that made all the difference. Matias teaches us that you don't need power to initiate change, you need conviction. That the true leader is not the strongest or the most popular, but the one who stands firm when the truth is at stake. He shows that faith is not just belief, it is action. It is the choice to remain faithful, even when it costs dearly. Sometimes we think that great stories are made by kings, famous warriors, or prophets with thunderous voices, but Mattathias shows us otherwise. That all it takes is a family man with principles in his heart and courage in his eyes to reverse the course of history. And even though today's world is different, the kind of struggle remains the same. They still try to erase values, sell shortcuts, and silence those who stand up. But then we remember Matatias, and we understand that in front of any false altar, we can still say no. We can still stand up. We can still light a flame that will never be extinguished. If you liked Matatias' story and want to continue following other stories of faith and overcoming adversity, be sure to like this video and share it with your loved ones. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any new content. Together, we will explore more powerful lessons from the Bible.